Apparently, if you earn something like £35,000 a year in Britain, you may already be part of the world's richest 10% of carbon emitters. And honestly, when I first heard that, my reaction was basically, oh, come on, give the rest of us a break. Because when people hear phrases like the richest 10%, a lot of us immediately picture billionaires, private jets, ultra-rich elite completely detached from ordinary society. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized that we often mix together several completely different groups of people when we talk about the rich. So in this video, I want to explore the difference between the world's richest 10% of emitters, ordinary millionaires, and what people like Gary Stevenson actually mean when they talk about the super rich. What I found surprising was how broad the definition of the top 10% actually is. Groups like Oxfam usually define this globally based on income, and depending on how you measure it, you can end up in the global top 10% with an income of roughly £30,000 to £40,000 a year, which is honestly much lower than many people imagine. And the thing is, I probably fall somewhere near the lower end of that group myself. So even someone like me, living in the UK, struggling with rising living costs, not even owning a car, and sometimes feeling like I'm just trying to get by, can still technically fall into that category. Which means that in countries like the UK, many teachers, engineers, office workers, nurses, and other completely ordinary people could be part of the global top 10%. And that matters because when climate researchers talk about the top 10%, they're usually talking about global emissions. Flying more often, driving more, living in larger homes, buying more products, and using more energy overall. In other words, this is really about how lifestyles in wealthier countries create disproportionately large carbon footprints. And that's where things get uncomfortable. Because if people like us in wealthy countries are also part of this picture, then climate change isn't just about blaming billionaires or the super rich. It also means we need to seriously think about our own impacts and the kind of future we are collectively creating. So just to be clear, these discussions are often talking about completely different things. When climate researchers talk about the global top 10%, they're usually talking about emissions in a lifestyle. But when people like Gary Stevenson talk about the super rich, they're usually talking about accumulated asset and ownership, not ordinary salaries. So even though the language sounds similar, these are not the same group of people at all. And I think this becomes much easier to understand if we think about wealth in layers. I came across this framework in Peter Turchin's book, End Times, and it's surprisingly useful. And it's worth saying that most middle class people in Britain are nowhere near these levels of wealth, especially younger generations. A lot of professionals with decent salaries still don't have huge assets once you exclude pensions or rising house prices. So even talking about millionaires already means talking about a relatively wealthy part of society. Right, the first layer. These are the ordinary millionaires, and in the UK, this can include doctors, lawyers, executives, or people who simply own a very expensive home in London. At this level, wealth is still closely tied to normal professional life, and much of it isn't liquid. It's in property and pensions. And second layer. This is where we start talking about the super rich, the kind of wealth that often comes up in debates about wealth taxes. Business owners, large investors, and people with extensive property portfolios dominate this tier. You also often come across something called family office, a private organization that manages the wealth of a wealthy family. Here, wealth is less about salary and more about owning assets that generate income on their own. And the third layer. This is ultra-rich territory, and at this level, wealth is no longer about what you earn, it's about what you own. We're talking about companies, investment holdings, and diversified assets across multiple sectors. And finally, 1 billion and above. Billionaires. At this point, we're talking about wealth that can have systemic influence, not just on markets, but sometimes politics and public debates as well. So the key idea is simple. Wealth doesn't just increase in size, it changes structure at each level. And what's fascinating is that taxation changes dramatically across these layers. People in the 1 million to 10 million pounds range often receive high salaries, but a lot of that goes out in income tax, national insurance, mortgage costs, and so on. But once wealth becomes heavily asset-based, the system often starts working very differently. Capital gains taxes are lower, unrealized gains often aren't taxed at all, and wealth can move through trust, offshore structures, and long-term holdings. So the core complaint from people like Gary Stevenson is not simply that some people have more money. It's that labor is heavily taxed, while large-scale asset accumulation can continue compounding almost indefinitely. And I think this matters politically, but also environmentally. Because if we blur all these groups together, we start misunderstanding both climate inequality and economic inequality at the same time. Someone earning £60,000 a year and someone worth £1 billion are not operating inside the same economic reality. And at the same time, someone in the global top 10% of emissions is not necessarily part of the ultra-rich class shaping investment systems, energy systems, and political influence. So although the word rich keeps appearing in all these debates, it's often describing completely different worlds. And maybe that's why so many debates about climate change, inequality, and taxation become confused. The teacher taking one holiday flight a year, the London professional with a mortgage, the multimillionaire investor, and the billionaire class influencing global systems. These are not the same category of people. And if you want serious conversations about climate change, emissions, inequality, or economic reform, I think we probably need to become a little more precise about which layer we are actually talking about. Anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for watching.